Ecosystems rarely end neatly. Where a dense forest canopy stops and a vast grassland begins, the physical environment changes abruptly. Ecologists call this transition zone an ecotone, the exact area where two adjacent ecological communities overlap and interact. Look closely at this boundary. Soil types, moisture levels, and vegetation layers from both communities mix to form a unique, heterogeneous habitat. Take a mangrove forest. Here, salt water physically washes through the root systems of terrestrial trees, creating a direct intersection of marine and land environments. This physical overlap operates as an ecological engine. The blending of two distinct habitats dictates exactly how and where species distribute themselves across the entire landscape. This dynamic produces a predictable biological outcome, known as the edge effect. At the boundary between two ecosystems, you will consistently find greater species diversity and population density than you would deep inside either ecosystem alone. Wildlife manager Aldo Leopold formally documented this phenomenon in 1933 while studying how game animals gravitate toward habitat margins. This diagram illustrates why the edge effect occurs. An ecotone provides simultaneous access to food and shelter from both adjacent communities. It contains high structural complexity and establishes intermediate microclimatic gradients. Combined, these features support a concentrated explosion of distinct ecological niches. Estuaries demonstrate this principle at scale. The nutrient influx from freshwater rivers and ocean tides makes the transition zone one of the most productive environments. By offering resources from two systems simultaneously, a natural ecotone functions as both an evolutionary hotspot and a vital shelter during times of environmental stress. High biodiversity at the boundary does not mean all organisms thrive there. A species' ability to survive an ecotone depends entirely on its specific resource requirements. This curve represents the niche breadth of an edge species. These are generalists with broad ecological tolerances. They capitalize on the mixed resources and heterogeneous structure of the boundary. The white-tailed deer is a classic edge generalist. It can forage in open clearings while using the adjacent dense forest line for immediate cover. Compare that to an interior species. As this narrow curve shows, interior specialists have highly restrictive habitat requirements. They are sensitive to edge disturbances and require deep, unbroken environments. Large mammals like the tiger are area-sensitive interior specialists. They rely on vast contiguous core habitats to maintain sufficient prey bases and avoid human conflict. The very same environmental conditions that provide a thriving resource buffer for a generalist act as a lethal, uninhabitable barrier for a specialist. When human activity actively breaks apart these contiguous landscapes, we trigger a process called habitat fragmentation. Ecologists measure this disruption using edge density, calculating the total length of the boundary edge compared to the total area of the landscape. This spatial model illustrates an intact habitat block with a protected interior core. Watch what happens when a clear-cut bisects this space. As the habitat fragments, the edge-to-interior ratio increases exponentially until the interior core ceases to exist, causing interior species populations to decline. Fragmentation is a geometric transformation. It systematically annihilates the deep core habitat required by interior specialists, while artificially subsidizing generalists that thrive on the perimeter. It is a mistake to view an ecological boundary as a flat, two-dimensional line on a map. The edge bleeds into the forest. The tensor of edge influence measures how deeply boundary conditions penetrate a habitat. Abiotic factors hit first, ruining the first 50 meters for sensitive species. Invasive plants colonize up to 100 meters, and nest predators exploit the edge to hunt 200 meters into the fragment. One of the most severe threats comes from obligate birdoparasites, like the brown-headed cowbird. Cowbirds wait at the open edge, then fly up to 300 meters inside the forest canopy to lay their eggs in the nests of interior songbirds, outcompeting the native chicks. Because edge influence reaches hundreds of meters deep, and over a kilometer for large mammals, a conservation reserve that looks large on paper may actually contain zero functional interior space. A natural ecotone is a gradual transition forged over millennia. An anthropogenic or human-made edge is an abrupt fracture. The sudden, unnatural influx of light and physical disturbance at artificial borders creates an immediate entry point for aggressive invasive species to outcompete native flora. When agricultural land is pushed directly against deep forest, it forces local wildlife into constant contact with domestic livestock and human settlements. These specific boundaries act as high-risk transmission vectors. Pathogens circulating harmlessly in deep forest wildlife spill over the edge, driving zoonotic disease outbreaks like Ebola and Nipah. This is a stark contrast to intact natural ecotones like riparian zones. Here, the dense, continuous vegetation acts as a protective buffer, filtering agricultural runoff and regulating water temperatures for aquatic life. Hard, human-created edges strip away this buffering capacity entirely. They remove the protective transition zone, exposing the interior ecosystem directly to external collapse. Look at a map of a modern ecosystem. On the left, we see continuous natural gradients. On the right, fractured, isolated habitat islands. This expression states the biological reality of intact boundaries. Ecotone diversity is reliably greater than either adjacent community. But when we carve up the landscape, the math turns against the ecosystem. A rising edge to interior ratio guarantees a decline in area-sensitive species. This exact mathematical relationship drives the SLOS debate in conservation, the question of whether it is better to protect a single large reserve or several small ones. Small reserves maximize edge, large reserves protect the core. Combined with island biogeography theory, the depth of edge influence explains why isolated terrestrial patches steadily lose species richness over time. Without contiguous corridors, the interior simply bleeds out. An ecological boundary is an active mathematical environment. Whether it functions as a vibrant evolutionary transition or a rigid zone of extinction depends entirely on the spatial geometry we leave behind.